I was in the park last weekend just trying to read. It was one of those rare, quiet afternoons. Then this group sets up about 20 feet away. They pull out a huge portable speaker and just blast this incredibly loud thumping music. You could see the reaction ripple across the grass. An older couple trying to nap, a family having a picnic, a guy walking his dog. Everyone just sort of flinched. A few people shot them angry looks, but the music just kept pounding. After a few minutes, one of the guys from the group caught me looking. He just shrugged, almost smiled, and shouted over the noise, "It's a free country, man. Just doing my thing." That line stuck with me. It's a free country. It's the ultimate defense, isn't it? The idea that his absolute right to do his thing was the only thing that mattered. It didn't matter that he was imposing his will on 20 other people. His individual desire came first. This idea that freedom means being a self-contained unit, that our rights come from nature itself, and that society is just a collection of people doing their thing, it's the foundation of almost everything. But what if that entire foundation is built on a complete fantasy?
Yeah, that phrase, "it's a free country." I mean, it really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It perfectly captures this core tension in how we live today. You've basically laid out the central idea of Western political thought. The individual comes first, before society, and rights are just inherent. They aren't given by anyone. It's just the default assumption now.
It really is.
So our mission, I think, in this deep dive is to really dig into the intellectual roots of that individual desire first way of thinking. We're going to trace it back to its, well, pretty speculative origins in the West, this whole concept of the state of nature. Then we'll see how it got locked in during the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And crucially, we're going to, take a hard look at that whole Western setup, maybe deconstruct it a bit using some later critiques, and then contrast it. Pit it against other ways of thinking about law and morality, ones that maybe ground rights in the group and society's goals, not just the lone individual. The aim here is to figure out what assumptions about human nature you absolutely have to make for this very individualistic modern system to even seem logical.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. So Western political thought, it anchors its whole definition of rights, of government, in this philosophical guessing game, the state of nature. Woo! This picture of us before laws, before government, before that guy with the speaker showed up. The big question is, what were we actually like back then? Were we these, rational, independent people, or just scared animals?
It is the foundational thought experiment, yeah. And the really key thing here, the insight, is that the big three social contract thinkers, the guys who basically built modern politics, they came up with wildly different answers. They all start kind of agreeing, okay, humans are naturally equal in some basic way. But right away, they split dramatically on human morality, which tells you that this supposedly natural basis for our individualism, it's actually really shaky, built on speculation and contradiction from the get-go.
Okay, let's start with the really grim picture. Thomas Hobbes, he's the original pessimist, right? The guy who essentially said, leave people alone and they'll just end up killing each other. Maybe for fun, even.
Well, that's not too far off his conclusion, actually. Hobbes' view of the state of nature, which he lays out in Leviathan back in 1651, it's famously just awful, terrifying. He called it bellum omne contra omnes, the war of all against all. Life in that state, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Just bleak.
So what was driving that constant fighting? It wasn't simply bloodlust, was it? There had to be more to it.
No, not just bloodlust. He points to three main drivers, rooted in psychology and just the basic facts of life back then. First, competition. People attack because they want stuff and there isn't enough to go around. Scarcity drives conflict. Second, diffidence. That's basically fear or distrust. People attack preemptively for safety because they can't trust anyone else not to attack them first. And third, glory. People attack for reputation, for vanity, to make others fear them. And because, as Hobbes pointed out, even the weakest person can kill the strongest, maybe through trickery or teaming up, everyone is basically equally dangerous. Crucially, in this state, there's no right or wrong, no morality, no justice, just constant fear. That's the dominant emotion.
Okay, so if it's all about constant crippling fear, then the whole point of government must just be survival, pure and simple. Order at any cost. So what do people have to give up to get out of this mess?
Everything. Literally everything. Hobbes demands that people hand over all their individual rights, all their power, all their liberty to one single, absolute, all-powerful ruler, the Leviathan. And it's important how this happens. The social contract isn't a deal between the people and the ruler. It's a deal the people make with each other, where they all agree, okay, we will obey this sovereign.
But wait, giving the sovereign carte blanche, total power, doesn't that just swap the fear of everyone else for the fear of one tyrant? How is that freedom? Isn't that just trading one kind of fear for another.
That's the absolute core tension in Hobbes, you're right. But he'd argue it's a rational trade, the fear of a predictable, if arbitrary, sovereign. That's external. You kind of know where you stand. It's way better, he thinks, than the built-in, constant, chaotic fear of the state of war where anyone could kill you at any moment for any reason. Stability is the absolute top priority. Almost any cost is worth paying to avoid chaos, because chaos is the ultimate enemy of any kind of liberty. So the sovereign gets this nearly unquestionable authority because any challenge, any fight against the sovereign risks throwing everyone back into that nightmare state of war. The sovereign is like this artificial person created specifically to soak up and neutralize all those clashing individual wills.
Okay, so Hobbes paints this picture of us as basically warring brutes who desperately need absolute control just to survive. Then along comes John Locke, and he gives us a totally different view, doesn't he? This is the one that really shaped, well, America and a lot of European thinking. He doesn't see us as inherently evil, just maybe inconvenient to each other.
Exactly. Inconvenient is a good word for it. Locke's second treatise of government offers a much sunnier state of nature. He argued that humans are fundamentally rational beings. We're guided by natural law, which basically says nobody should harm anyone else's life, health, liberty, or possessions. So for Locke, the state of nature isn't great, but it's tolerable. We already have rights in that state, inherent inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. And property is key for Locke, famously derived from labor.
Right. Explain that bit about labor and property, because that seems crucial for his whole focus, especially later on with capitalism and stuff.
Yeah, it's fundamental. Locke argues that your labor is the one thing that's undeniably yours. So when you take something from the common stock nature and mix your labor with it, you make it your property. His example is picking an apple. The apples on the tree are common, but the moment you expend your effort, your labor, to pick one, that apple becomes yours. And since property is a natural right that exists before the state, the government can't just abolish it. This idea of proprietary individualism, that's maybe Locke's biggest gift to modern capitalism.
Okay, so if the state of nature is pretty rational, and we already have rights like property, why do we even need government? If it's tolerable, why leave? What's the problem?
The problem is enforcement. In nature, if someone violates natural law, steals your apple, say everyone has the right to punish the offender, everyone is judge, jury, and executioner. And that, Locke says, leads to problems. People are biased in their own cases. Punishments might be excessive. It leads to feuds, cycles of revenge. It's messy. So Locke's idea of government is radically limited compared to Hobbes. Its main purpose, really its only legitimate purpose, is to secure and protect those pre-existing natural rights, especially property. How? By setting up an unbiased judge, a common authority like courts, to resolve disputes fairly.
So Locke basically invents the idea of the limited government, the night watchman state almost. Its power comes entirely from the consent of the people being governed, and it has to start short of messing with those fundamental natural rights that came before it. That famous phrase, life, liberty, and property, that becomes the foundation for saying government exists to serve the individual.
Absolutely. And unlike Hobbes's all-powerful sovereign, Locke's government is conditional. If the government breaks a contract, if it violates the people's natural rights, the people have the right to revolt. Stability matters? Sure. But for Locke, liberty and rights come first. They trump mere security.
Okay, and then we get the third major figure, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Romantic, maybe the idealist. If Hobbes gave us the brute and Locke gave us the rational property owner, Rousseau gives us the noble savage.
Right, Rousseau throws another curveball. He offers this third vision, maybe the most emotionally resonant, but also the most philosophically tricky. He argued that early humans, primitive man, were inherently good, free, equal, compassionate, the noble savage. Corruption, inequality, vice, all that bad stuff. Rousseau insisted it comes only from society. And specifically, it starts with the invention of private property, which creates comparison, jealousy, and hierarchy. For Rousseau, liberty is everything. It's what makes us human. He famously said, to renounce liberty is to renounce being a man. Giving it up means giving up your humanity, your rights, even your duties.
So stability without real liberty, that's just tyranny for him.
Completely. Which leads him to his idea of the social contract. But his version is very different. That's designed to maximize liberty, paradoxically, by having everyone completely merge into the community, into what he calls the general will.
Okay, the general will. This always confuses me. How is that different from just, what most people want, majority rule, or even what he called the will of all?
Yeah, this is where Rousseau gets really complex, and frankly, historically kind of dangerous. The will of all is simple enough. It's just adding up everyone's private selfish desires. What does the majority want for themselves right now? The general will, though, is something different. It's supposed to be this impersonal, objective, moral force that always aims at the common good. It's what's truly best for everyone in the long run, even if, maybe, every single person at that moment disagrees with it based on their private interests. The general will is always right, Rousseau claims, but the people, they can be mistaken about what it is.
Wow. So citizens aren't supposed to vote for what benefits them personally. They're supposed to figure out and vote for this abstract common good. That sounds incredibly demanding.
It is. It demands constant active participation from everyone. That's why Rousseau hated the idea of political representation, like electing people to make decisions for you. He thought that was a total betrayal of liberty. The moment you elect representatives, he argued, you're only free during the election itself. After that, you're enslaved again. Citizens can't delegate their civic duty. You have to be involved. So the individual gets sort of absorbed into this general will. But Rousseau argues they don't really lose anything important. They lose the fake freedom of the corrupted state, but they gain true civil liberty and the equality they had back in the state of nature.
So the big takeaway here is pretty stark. The very foundation of Western individualism, the idea that justifies everything from constitutional rights down to that guy blasting music in the park, it doesn't rest on some agreed-upon, solid fact about human nature. Instead, it's built on three fundamentally different speculative stories. Hobbes' terrified brute needing absolute control.
Right.
Locke's rational property owner needing limited government. And Rousseau's noble savage needing total immersion in a collective morality. They can't all be right.
Exactly. And that uncertainty, that shift, especially from the brute to the property owner, that's the engine that drives us into the Enlightenment and how these ideas got locked into place.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Because these weren't just...
Well, the Enlightenment at its core was about taking the logic of the scientific revolution, reason, skepticism, looking at evidence and applying it to human stuff, to society, to government. The thinking was kind of, if Newton can figure out universal laws for planets, surely we can use reason to figure out universal rights for people. And this focus on reason and individual liberty led directly to demands for things like constitutional government, the rule of law, and critically the development of secularism.
Right, secularism, the separation of church and state. We almost take it for granted today, but you're saying this wasn't just some philosopher's preference. It came out of real-world necessity, even fraudulence.
Oh, absolutely. It was a direct, and you could say brutal, reaction to the century of religious wars that came right before it in Europe. You really can't overestimate the trauma of that period, especially the 30 Years' War. We're talking maybe 8 million deaths across Central Europe, a continental catastrophe fueled entirely by religious differences between Catholics and Protestants. So thinkers at the time realized if we don't find a way to limit the political power of organized religion, society is just going to be stuck in these endless, bloody wars over whose dogma is right. Secularism wasn't just about intellectual freedom, it was a political technology. It was designed to shift people's primary loyalty away from God and the church and towards reason, the nation-state, and finding political consensus.
And the philosophical blueprint for pulling off that huge separation, that again comes largely from Locke, building on his social contract ideas.
Yes, Locke is key again. He argued that when rational people form a government through a social contract, they simply cannot hand over control of their individual conscience, their path to salvation, to the state. It's impossible, illogical. So that establishes the bedrock idea. You have a natural right to liberty of conscience. Your inner beliefs, your relationship with God, that has to remain totally private. The state can't touch it. This is really the conceptual engine behind modern secularism. It makes the individual, not the church or the community, the final judge of religious truth.
That sounds pretty good. I mean, protecting your inner self from the government forcing beliefs on you seems like the high point of liberal thought, right? Protecting everyone, no matter what they believe. Universal protection.
And that's definitely the heroic story we often tell ourselves about the Enlightenment. But the historical sources, when you look closely, they reveal a really crucial internal contradiction. It kind of undermines that claim of universality right from the start. We have to recognize that there were built-in cultural boundaries to this early Western rights talk. Locke, even though he was a pioneer of tolerance for his time, his tolerance was very conditional, highly selective.
Okay, so who got left out? Who did Locke's supposedly universal tolerance not extend to? This is where the rubber meets the road, I guess.
Right. Well, he primarily extended tolerance to other Protestant Christians.
Yeah.
That was the group he saw as, rational, capable of self-government, fitting his model. But he specifically excluded three major groups from this protection.
Okay, tell us why for each one, because this really tests that whole universal rights narrative.
First, he excluded Catholics. Now, this was partly pragmatic, partly political. Locke saw Catholics as inherently intolerant themselves. But more importantly, he believed their ultimate loyalty was foreign to the Pope in Rome. That meant, in his view, they could never be truly loyal citizens of a Protestant country like England. Their allegiance was suspect. Second, he excluded atheists. This was fundamental for Locke. He believed morality was completely tied to belief in God, a God who rewards good and punishes evil. Since atheists didn't believe in God, they had no fear of divine punishment. Therefore, Locke argued, they couldn't be trusted. They were inherently immoral, incapable of upholding oaths or contracts, which are the glue of society. Take God out, and the whole social contract falls apart for him. Third, and this one really shows the cultural biases, he excluded Muslims. His reasoning here was explicitly cultural and well-prejudiced. He basically considered Islamic culture and morality crude and odd, maybe even substandard. It reflected a pretty common attitude of intellectual and cultural superiority among many Enlightenment thinkers in Europe at the time, looking at the non-European world.
Wow, that's actually staggering when you lay it out like that. It forces you to stop and think. The very foundation of modern, secular, supposedly universal rights, the idea that my individual conscience is sacred and protected from the state, was simultaneously used to justify excluding huge groups of people. So it wasn't really about discovering some innate universal rights for all humans. It was more like the political and cultural elevation of a very specific type of individual, the rational, property-owning Protestant man.
It definitely reveals that the individual the Enlightenment was trying to protect was already a very specific, culturally defined concept. The rights were framed as universal, sure, but in practice, they were entirely conditional. It undermines the philosophical purity of the whole project. And this inherent contradiction, this gap between theory and practice, it leads directly into the really sharp critiques that came later, especially in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right? If we connect this whole story forward, the entire Enlightenment project, with its focus on rights, contracts, liberty, it eventually came under some really radical, you might even say brutal critique, thinkers like Michel Foucault. And this raises a really challenging question for us today. What if this whole liberal focus on rights, which we tend to see as our shield against power, is actually just a really sophisticated disguise, a cover story for a new, maybe more insidious form of modern control?
Yeah, this is where Foucault comes in and basically says, hey, all that comforting political language you use, it's completely useless for understanding how power actually works now.
Yeah.
He looked at the legal system, the whole promise of liberal progress, and essentially said, nope, that's just a different kind of prison.
Precisely. Foucault fundamentally rejected the whole narrative of moral or legal progress. He didn't think humanity was getting freer or better. We just move, he argued, from one system of domination to another. And he specifically went after what he called the classical juridical theory of power. That's basically the Hobbes-Locke model. Power is a transaction between the big state, which represses, and the free individual who has rights. For Foucault, that whole model, it's an outdated fantasy. It doesn't describe reality anymore.
And he claimed that the social contract itself, this idea of us consenting to be governed, was never really about freedom, even though that's how it's taught.
Correct. Foucault's reading is that the social contract idea emerged back in the 16th, 17th centuries, not as some grand theory of liberation, but mainly as a tool, a way for the newly emerging centralized monarchies to legitimate their power over large populations. Think about it. If a king could claim his subjects had voluntarily agreed to his rule, then things like state coercion, taxes, armies, prisons suddenly look justified, even rational.
So when we think our rights are like these shields, these trumps against state interference, Foucault would say we've got it backwards. The legal system itself, he claims, didn't arise to protect us from the state, but actually arose and still functions, mainly to justify state power and coercion over us.
It makes our submission seem like our own choice.
He completely flips the script. The law isn't primarily about justice. It's a system for classifying, organizing, and ultimately dominating populations, making them manageable.
And crucially, the kind of power that does this managing today isn't the old school power of the king, visible, top-down, repressive sovereign power.
Right. So if modern control isn't mainly exercised through, the threat of the guillotine or the dungeon anymore, that sovereign power, how is it exercised? What took the place of the king just saying off with his head?
It was replaced, Foucault argued, by disciplinary power. This is his core distinction, really. Sovereign power is easy to see. It's top-down, it forbids things, it punishes spectacularly when rules are broken. Think public executions. Disciplinary power is totally different. It's sneaky. It's diffuse, spread out, not located in one person like the king. It's capillary, meaning it reaches everywhere, down to the tiniest levels of our lives, our bodies, our minds, our habits. And his main goal isn't to repress or forbid, it's to produce, to shape the individual into a standardized, predictable, observable, and ultimately useful kind of person, a subject.
So when people were fighting for civil rights or demanding privacy rights, Foucault might see that not purely as liberation from power, but actually as participating in, maybe even strengthening a new kind of power. How does that work in the real world? That sounds counterintuitive.
Let's try an analogy. Sovereign power says, don't steal. If you do, I'll chop off your hand. Very clear, very negative. Disciplinary power is much more subtle, more positive in a weird way. It says, we're going to create standardized schools to shape your mind from childhood. We'll track your health records, your work performance, your credit score. We'll monitor your online activity. We'll subject you to constant evaluations and assessments. Quote, we'll shape you so thoroughly through all these systems that you won't even think of stealing. Or if you do, the deviation will be immediately flagged, categorized, and dealt with, probably through treatment or re-education, rather than just punishment. This is what Foucault called the dark side of the Enlightenment. All those institutions that were supposedly about progress and reason, schools, hospitals, factories, prisons, even psychiatry, he saw them as laboratories for developing these techniques of domination, of normalizing behavior. That self that Locke thought was natural and came before society. Foucault says, no, that self is a product of these disciplinary systems. We are manufactured subjects.
That connects directly to the feeling we get dealing with the modern administrative state, right? The DMV, the tax authorities, HR departments, insurance companies. It's not usually fear of violence, but this deep frustration with bureaucracy, with endless forms, with being measured and categorized and standardized.
That frustration, that is the feeling of disciplinary power. The law itself is changing. It's less about dramatic punishment now and much more about regulation, setting norms, managing populations efficiently. The courts, the police, they're merging into this bigger network of administrative, medical, social control systems. We aren't primarily ruled by the king's decree anymore. We're managed by the constant, quiet, normalizing judgments and assessments of experts, algorithms, and bureaucrats. The focus shifts from punishing the criminal act to normalizing the entire population.
Which means we're operating with this huge time lag in our thinking. When we argue for individual right to privacy against, say, a tech company, or a right to autonomy against some bureaucratic rule, we're using the language of the 17th century, the sovereign versus the individual, to try and fight a 21st century form of power that this language wasn't even designed to see, let alone resist.
That's the critical insight exactly. The state today, in this view, often just acts as the coder, the enforcer of the normalizing rules generated elsewhere by economists, doctors, psychologists, data analysts, engineers. So our cherished legal framework of individual rights, the one we hold up as the ultimate guarantor of freedom, Foucault forces us to ask if it might also function as a very sophisticated ideological mask, hiding a much more pervasive, invisible system of control that shapes who we are.
So the important question isn't just what are the legitimate limits of state power anymore. Maybe it's how am I being produced, shaped, and categorized right now by all these diffuse power networks that operate outside that old state versus individual model. It demands a total rethink of where rights even come from and what they actually do. Okay, so we've traced the Western model. It starts with this shaky, debatable idea of humans in isolation in nature, and it ends up with a system of rights that, while promising freedom, gets heavily criticized by thinkers like Foucault as maybe just a more subtle form of control. Let's turn now to look at an alternative way of thinking about rights, one that doesn't start with the isolated individual and their desires, but maybe grounds rights in shared moral goals, in the needs of society as a whole.
Yeah, this contrast is really important, especially because on a global stage, the whole concept of human rights is actually pretty contested. Many scholars, particularly from non-Western backgrounds, point out that the standard UN version of human rights grew directly out of that very specific Western tradition we've been talking about. Secular, individualistic, often explicitly anti-religious in its philosophical roots. Trying to simply merge that model with other traditions that have different starting points, it's often like trying to mix oil and water, structurally difficult. So, as an example of a different foundation, we can look at the framework within Islamic legal philosophy known as Maqasid al-Sharia. That translates roughly as the higher objectives or intents of the sacred law. Now, where Western liberalism tends to focus on maximizing the autonomy of the individual, Remember the guy in the park, my desire comes first. The Mackayed approach puts the emphasis somewhere else. It stresses achieving the higher moral goals of the law for the benefit of the entire community, for the collective good.
Okay, so what are these higher objectives? Can you give us a sense of what they are? Are they categorized?
Yes. Traditionally, Islamic scholars have identified 5 core maqaid. These are the essential things the law aims to protect and promote, because they are necessary for human flourishing, both individually and collectively. They are the protection of first, religion or faith, din; second, life, nafs; third, intellect or reason, aqwal; fourth, progeny or family, nazl; and fifth, wealth or property, mal. In this framework, rights, including individual rights, get their legitimacy and meaning from how well they serve these 5 essential collective objectives. So it flips the emphasis slightly. Individual rights aren't necessarily the starting point or the ultimate end in themselves. They're often seen as the necessary means to achieve these broader societal goods. The focus shifts towards duty, responsibility, and reciprocal obligation, which then secure the rights. Interesting. So the moral aim is shared, it's societal, it's not just about my personal autonomy. How does that play out with something like human dignity? Because both systems claim to uphold human dignity, right? Absolutely. The idea of inherent human dignity is central in Islamic thought, just as it is in Western thought. But how it's applied or understood can be framed differently. Within the Maqaid framework, dignity is often understood through the lens of reciprocity and covenant. This principle is fundamental to Islamic concepts of justice. It's the idea that if you want your life, your property, your dignity to be protected by the community and the law, you have a corresponding duty to protect the life, property, and dignity of others. It's less about an abstract right you possess in isolation, and more about rights and duties that arise from being in relationship, in covenant, within a moral community.
You know, I think a common assumption, at least in the West, might be that a legal system based on religious objectives must inevitably lead to intolerance or force everyone to conform, especially minority groups who don't share the main faith. Does the history actually bear that out?
Well, historically, the application of this framework often allowed for significant pluralism, specifically through the mechanism of covenant or treaty, dhimma. Early Muslim jurists, working within this Maqaid framework, laid out extensive rights for non-Muslim communities living under Muslim rule, provided they entered into a covenant of peace and paid a specific tax. These rights typically included full freedom of religion, the right to practice their own faith, and also equal protection of their property and lives under the law. And importantly, this recognition often extended to protecting their communal autonomy, their ability to govern their own internal affairs according to their own moral standards, even when those standards differed from Islamic ones. We see this quite clearly in the writings of influential early jurists like Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani. He wrote extensively on the law of nations, basically. In his major work, he insisted that Christian communities who had made a peace treaty had the right to self-determination within their own towns. They could manage their own affairs and live by their own moral code, even concerning things Muslims considered forbidden.
Can you give a concrete example? How did that communal autonomy actually work in practice, legally?
A classic example involves the trade and consumption of things like wine and pork. For Muslims, these are strictly forbidden, haram, because they are seen as violating the Maqaid specifically, protecting the intellect, which wine impairs, and protecting life health, related to dietary laws about pork. However, because the covenanted non-Muslim communities, like Christians or Jews, were guaranteed religious freedom and communal self-governance, Islamic law historically permitted them to produce, sell, and consume wine and pork among themselves within their own communities. The Islamic legal system respected their communal boundaries and didn't try to impose a single uniform moral standard based on Islamic teachings onto their internal affairs. It wasn't trying to create a single secularized individual subject to one set of rules like the Enlightenment project arguably aimed to do.
That really is a stark contrast. Instead of trying to fit every single person into one standardized category of individual rights, which Foucault warned could become its own form of control, this alternative framework seems to have allowed for a high degree of legal and moral pluralism between communities based on mutual agreement, on covenant. The right to practice differently was granted, but it seems like it was grounded in that collective agreement and reciprocal obligation, not in some inherent pre-social autonomy of the lone individual.
Precisely. It shifts the entire foundation. It moves away from the solitary individual's desires as the starting point, and instead emphasizes our inherent relatedness, our existence within a moral and legal structure that's designed, at least in theory, to achieve the well-being of the whole community through these higher objectives.
So we started this whole deep dive thinking about that guy in the park, right? That's a free country, man. Just doing my thing. And what we've seen is that simple, almost reflexive defense, the absolute right to do my thing, isn't just some random outburst. It's really the logical endpoint of a very long, very specific, and actually quite contested Western philosophical tradition. One that began with imagining that solitary, rights-bearing person back in the state of nature.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating when you trace it through is how that Western foundation kind of buckles under the weight of its own internal contradictions and later critiques. We saw how its initial promise of universal rights was actually quite culturally specific from the get-go. And then how thinkers like Foucault compellingly argued that this very system of rights might now function, ironically, to categorize, normalize, and subtly control us, all under the banner of freedom. And when you place that against alternative foundations, like the Lockean approach, you see a fundamentally different starting point. Rights aren't grounded in escaping society, but in fulfilling obligations within society to achieve collective moral goals. It allows for different kinds of pluralism based on agreement and reciprocity, not on that contested fantasy of the totally independent, pre-political individual.
It's quite a journey. From Hobbes' fearful brute through Locke's rational property owner, Rousseau's noble savage, the Enlightenment's conditional tolerance, and then Foucault's disciplined subject. It really reveals just how historically constructed, how fragile, maybe even how culture-bound our dominant Western idea of the self actually is. The kind of legal and philosophical framework we adopt, it seems, doesn't just reflect who we are. It actively shapes the kind of self we are allowed or even encouraged to become. So the choice we're left grappling with, maybe, is between a philosophy built on that powerful but perhaps shaky fantasy of the self-contained pre-social individual, and one built on the idea that human beings are fundamentally, essentially, inherently related and obligated to each other within a shared moral and legal reality.